Wedge of black cloth. Fanshin had a hard time holding up his upper eyelids and looking at his fingers to count what meaningful things he had done in his life, only to sigh and sadly give up the job before the 5 chopstick-thin fingers on his right hand had finished counting. The smell of medicine in the hospital room was always so pungent, and the old man in the bed next to him had already reported to the Earth's Bodhisattva 2 days ago, so it would probably be his turn in a few more days. He had some kind of strange disease, myasthenia gravis, the kind of disease that is especially suitable for the hero of a romance novel. It was said that there was no cure, and that on the day of his future hiccups he would not be able to move anything, and only tears would be allowed to flow down his face. "But I'm not a romance novel hero," Fanshin mumbled, but it turned into a string of vague ravings since the muscles in both jaws were no longer functioning. He looked at the tip of his middle finger and sympathized with himself. "I'm still a virgin." It was true that he hadn't done anything meaningful in his life, except for helping old grandmothers cross the street, giving up his seat on the bus, getting along with his neighbors, and helping his classmates cheat on their exams. Fanshin was a traditionally useless and good man. His parents died a long time ago, so he was left alone in the hospital, waiting for the day to come when his life would end. Nothing good comes to a good man. In a silent and clear late night, Fanshin seemed to be able to clearly catch his throat muscles slowly relaxing, no longer able to loosen and tighten, and his respiratory muscles gradually flattening out weakly like a rubber band that had lost its elasticity. The clean little nurse from the hospital had run off somewhere, and beside her was an older woman who was rambling on about something with pity in her eyes. Is this what it means to die? For the fear of death and the desire for the taste of life, so that his heart welled up unprecedented complex feelings, and for their own death is actually not their heart's long-awaited cute little nurse, but this obeisant, undoubtedly even more added Fanshin heart of grief. Miserable, his eyes drooped, looking at the ward window blocking sunlight on the piece of black cloth, feel life is really lonely as shit. Miserable and miserable, a drop of wet liquid slipped from the corner of his eye. Fanshin was a little sad and stuck out his tongue to lick the liquid that slipped from the corner of his eye to his own lips, but was surprised to find that his tears were actually not only salty, but also had a little bit of a fishy odor. Could it be that because he rarely bathed in the hospital, even his tears started to smell bad? He couldn't help but curse angrily in his heart, calling you damn tearful, still really think you are the hero of a romance novel? But he immediately realized that something was wrong. Why was his tongue still able to stick out his lips to lick his own tears? According to the doctor, his own tongue had long since lost its mobility, and now its only function was that it could easily slide backwards into his esophagus, blocking his airway and thus becoming a rare genius in the world of swallowing his tongue and committing suicide. Then he realized that it had become easier for him to open his eyes. His sight was very open and his vision had become much better than before he got the disease. The scenery in front of his eyes was clear and bright, and a thing made of bamboo was straddling his eyes. Fanshin, who was originally in a daze, suddenly saw, through those bamboo pieces, a scene that shocked him. A dozen or so black-clothed men, filled with the feeling of killing, were holding sharp weapons and slashing towards themselves. He had no time to distinguish whether this was a dream or a strange experience before dying, purely subconsciously shrinking his head and covering both hands in front of his face. Any ordinary person would probably only have such an ostrich-like choice. Snorting. Countless air-breaking sounds rang out. Immediately after that were countless muffled grunts, and then there was silence. After a while, Fanshin felt that something was wrong, and carefully separated the palm covering his face by 2 fingers, peeking outside. Basket made of bamboo, the space in front of him is divided into countless pieces, and through these holes, you can clearly see a dozen or so dead bodies lying on the ground. The ground blood flows horizontally, fishy air rushes to the sky. Fanshin was terrified. What he saw in front of him was too real, making him unable to come back to his senses for a moment. Immediately afterward, he suddenly thought of the hand on his face. Could it be that his hand could also move? Could it be that he was really cured? Then what is going on with everything in front of him? Is this just dreaming? After waking up from the dream, he is still the invalid lying on the hospital bed who can't move a muscle and can only wait for death. If that's the case, then it would be better not to wake up in this dream. At least his hands can move, his eyes can blink. He thought somewhat sadly and ran his hand over his wet face. When he withdrew his hand, he realized that his hand was covered with a piece of blood, and it turned out that the drop of wet liquid that dripped from the corner of his eye just now was actually the blood of whoever splashed onto his face. Fanchon stared blankly at his own hands, his heart furiously crying out that this was definitely not his own hands. In front of him, it was a pair of white, cute little hands, stained with blood, looking like white lotuses blooming in the cultivator's field in General Erie, definitely not the little hands that an adult should have. The successive emotional impacts, one after another, surged into Fanchon's mind. He couldn't help but stay dumbfounded. Countless questions, incomparable horror occupied his body and mind. This year was the 57th year of the Qing dynasty era. His Majesty the Emperor had not yet finished leading his army to conquer the western barbarians. Earl Sinan was also accompanying the army, and the Empress Dowager and the Council of Elders ruled in Kyoto. On this day, a fire broke out in the Taiping residence on the outskirts of Kyoto on the banks of the Lujing River, and a group of Masters of the Night, taking advantage of the fire, rushed into the residence and killed everyone, committing a shocking case of bloodshed. A teenage servant of the compound took the young master to kill out of the night, was chased by a group of murderers wearing night clothes. The two sides have been fighting to the south of the city outside the road junction. The ambush of the masters did not think that this body has a handicap of the young man, actually is an unfathomable strong, and in the hills behind. There is even the other side of the reinforcements. The identity of the reinforcements was even more frightening too. These people. Black Knight. The murderers who had been killed by the crossbow arrows fell in a pool of blood and wailed. The reinforcements were mounted on horses, wearing black armor that reflected the moonlight in the sky and glowed with an eerie, soul-consuming luster. Everyone in the cavalry held a hard crossbow that was only allowed to be equipped in the army, and the previous light crossbow shots had already killed most of the killers. In the arch of the black cavalry was a middle-aged man sitting in a carriage, with a pale face and a very sparse beard on his chin. He looked at the teenage servant in the field who was carrying a child on his back, nodded, and then gently clapped his hands. The clap was the signal to strike. The cavalrymen split into a group, and like scythes in the night, they charged into the dead and wounded assassins' ranks without mercy. Suddenly, one of the mages in the team of killers raised his staff and began to chant an incantation, and everyone in the arena could feel some unknown energy fluctuations begin to converge at the edge of this mound. The middle-aged man on the wagon frowned slightly and did nothing, but a dark shadow leapt out beside him and drifted past like a falcon speeding through the night sky. With a crunching sound, the mage's chanting crunched to a halt, and his head flew high into the air, blood raining down. The middle-aged man sitting on the carriage shook his head. These mages from the West always don't understand that in front of the truly strong, spells are just as ineffective as the Chancellor's pen. Dozens of solemn black cavalrymen confirmed the safety of the surroundings, clenched their right fists and made a gesture to report that the surroundings had been cleared of killers. The cavalry group parted, and the carriage inside slowly moved forward to the front of the teenage servant. The middle-aged man on the carriage sat on a wheelchair with the help of his subordinates, and the middle-aged man with bad legs pushed the wheelchair underneath him, slowly approaching the teenager in the center of the field, who had been straight as a gun. Looking at the bamboo basket behind the young servant, the pale face of the wheelchair-bound middle-aged man finally showed a hint of redness. Finally, nothing has happened. The person carrying the bamboo basket had a black cloth belt covering his face. His hand was carrying a black brazier that looked like a sword but was not a sword. There was still blood slowly dripping down from the brazier. There were many dead corpses lying on his side. The dead corpses were all masters of ambush. There were blood spots remaining on the corpse's throat, which appeared to be fatal in one blow. I need you guys to give me an answer on this matter. The person with black cloth bands over his eyes said coldly. His voice spoke without a trace of trembling or emotion. The soft and pitying color on the face of the middle-aged man sitting on the wheelchair appeared and disappeared. I will naturally give you an account, and I must also give my master an account. The teenage servant covered in a black cloth belt nodded, then prepared to leave. Where are you taking this child? The middle-aged man sitting in the wheelchair said coldly, "You are blind. Are you going to let the young master follow you around the world? This is the young lady's flesh and blood. This is also the master's flesh and blood." The middle-aged man in the wheelchair spoke grimly, "I promise to find the young master a very safe place in Kyoto." The man shook his head and tugged at the strip of black cloth on his own face. The middle-aged man in the wheelchair knew that the other person was not able to order him except to listen to that young lady, even if he was his own master, so he could only sigh and persuade. "The matter in Kyoto will surely be put to rest when the master comes back. Why do you have to take him away?" "I don't trust your master." The middle-aged man frowned slightly, seemingly disgusted with the other party's words, and after a short pause of half a day, said, "A child drinking milk and learning to read and write. Do you know how to do these things?" He sneered, "Blind man, what else would you do besides killing people?" The man was not angry and gently pushed the bamboo basket behind him. "Cripple, you seem to only know how to kill people as well." The middle-aged man smiled grimly. "The ones who struck out this time are only those princes and nobles in Kyoto. When my master returns, I will naturally start working on cleaning them up." The blind teenager shook his head. The middle-aged man's hand gently stroked on the wheelchair, as if he was guessing what the other party was afraid of. A moment later, he frowned. "I know what you are afraid of, but in this secular world, other than the child's father being able to protect him, who else would have the ability to protect him from escaping that unknown danger?" The blind teenager suddenly spoke, his voice still as emotionless as ever, "A new identity, an undisturbed life." The middle-aged man thought for a moment and nodded with a smile. "Where?" "Danjo Harbor, where the master's mama now resides." After a moment of silence, the blind teenager finally accepted the arrangement. The middle-aged man smiled as he pushed his wheelchair and turned behind the blind teenager, stretching out his hands to pick up the child in the bamboo basket, looking at the little child's ice-carved cute little face, sighing, "It really does look exactly like his mom. It's so beautiful." He suddenly laughed out loud and said, "This little guy will definitely have a future when he grows up." Those subordinates of his in the distance stood in silence, suddenly hearing the adult let out such a happy laughter. Although their faces remained motionless, deep down they were very shocked, not knowing what kind of important character this little child was. The young blind man inclined his head and reached out to pick the child back up, and while he was more innocent than the average human, he was reluctant to let the face of the infant in the basket get too close to this viper's hand, all the while using a monosyllabic word to express a question of pure politeness. The middle-aged man smiled, and looked into the face of the little child with a smile that was unspoken and particularly frightening. A child who is only 2 months old can actually reach out and wipe the blood off his face, and after experiencing such a horrible thing tonight, he can still sleep so soundly. It's really worthy of. His voice was suddenly pressed very low, ensuring that none of his subordinates could hear the words he uttered afterward, "The child of a heavenly veins person." This middle-aged man holds great power in Kyoto. His methods are ruthless, but any offending official falls into his hands. Within 2 days will spit out the truth. His vision is even more venomous, but it is such an extraordinary character. But also did not see that this small child is not sleeping sweetly, but was scared and fainted. Heavenly veiners, heaven refers to the upper heaven, and vein refers to the bloodline. Heavenly veiners means the bloodline left behind on earth by the heavens. In the legends of this world, every few hundred years, a bloodline left behind on earth by the heavens would begin to awaken. This bloodline could represent a battle power so powerful that it could not be resisted, such as the great general in the distant ancient country of Naos, who, at the historical juncture when his country was about to be destroyed by the barbarians, assassinated most of the members of the primitive council of the barbarians with his personal bravery and battle power. There are also some heavenly chakra people who will show great talent in art or wisdom, such as the one in the west, the archmage of Por and his wife, the playwright Fubo, who had just died 300 years ago. Naturally, no one can prove that they are the bloodline left behind by the divine in favor of the suffering earth. But the fact is that these few people brought peace and many other things to the earth. Moreover, all of the Heavenly Veins people eventually disappeared without a trace, and no one, not even the country, could detect a trace of them. They just suddenly appeared and suddenly disappeared, leaving nothing to prove their existence except some obscure records. The middle-aged man sitting in the wheelchair happened to be one of the very few people who knew that such a vision as the Heavenly Veins did exist. For some reason, after Fanshin died, his soul came to this world, and it was this. Unbelievable that he was reborn into the body of a baby, and the father or mother of this baby was actually the mysterious and inexplicable Heavenly Vein man on the continent above. At dawn, the battlefield had already been cleaned up, and the carriage slowly walked up the stone road leading to the east, and after the carriage, a group of black cavalry and a pale middle-aged man sitting on a wheeled horse formed a very eerie picture. The wagon choked the stones and peaked, waking the infant lying flat on a soft-colored silk cushion. The baby's eyes left the faces of those who had saved their lives somewhat listlessly and looked at the front of the carriage, unlike ordinary babies whose vision wandered, clear and incomparable but unable to focus, but with a few more hints of an indescribable flavor. No one knows, such a tender little body, but actually holds a soul from a different world. As far as the eye could see, the curtain of the carriage floated up with the oncoming wind, revealing a corner of the green mountain color outside the carriage, and the long stone road that receded rapidly, like countless pictures that were being rewound without stopping. In front of the carriage, the blind boy was holding the brazier tightly in his hand, with a black cloth over his eyes, covering his eyes and the sky.